Sourdough bread. If you look on social media and elsewhere, everyone is raving about sourdough bread, how healthy it is, how much better it is than regular bread. And so for today's episode, I want to talk a little bit more about sourdough because my wife has been experimenting with sourdough for the past maybe 2 years or so. So we've been making sourdough bread and sourdough pizza for our monthly pizza night. We use the discard, when we make bread and whatever is left over, we kind of save up. We keep saving up and accumulating, and that's called the discard. And with that, we make pancakes every so often. And so let's talk a little bit about if sourdough is really healthy and what part of a quote-unquote animal-based diet sourdough can have.
Welcome to the Primal Shift podcast.
Before we get into that, let's talk about what is sourdough. What is it and how is it different to regular bread? Well, regular bread traditionally uses commercial yeast for rising. Sourdough uses wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria. And when these microbes ferment the dough, they produce carbon dioxide, and that causes the bread, to rise. And it gives the sourdough this characteristic tangy flavor and chewy texture that many people like so much. So the question is sourdough then healthier because of all of that? Well, the fermentation of sourdough is not just about the flavor and texture. It's about transforming the bread into something that's easier to digest and potentially healthier. So for example, during the fermentation, some of the gluten proteins are broken down, and as also not only the gluten protein, but also the other anti-nutrients such as phytic acid. Those get broken down, not entirely, but to a larger degree. And so you have fewer gluten, you have fewer other anti-nutrients, and that means the few nutrients that are in bread and the nutrients that are in the foods that you consume the bread with get more readily absorbed. So let's say you have, a piece of meat or eggs, whatever, and you eat a slice of bread with it. If you do that with regular bread, chances are some of those micronutrients in the good food, in the eggs or in the meat, don't get absorbed because of the anti-nutrients in the bread that you consume it with. With sourdough, that reduction in absorption of micronutrients is reduced. So you get more of those. That's a good thing. Sourdough generally also has a lower glycemic index, meaning your blood sugar rises slower than with regular bread. That's also generally a good thing. And the last thing is, because of the anti-nutrients are broken down and the beneficial microbes that are in the sourdough because of the fermentation improve the digestibility. So it might be easier for you to digest sourdough than regular bread. And those three things combined mean that sourdough, yes, is indeed healthier than regular bread, especially if you use the right types of grains, and we get to that here in a moment. But one thing to remember is that healthier doesn't necessarily mean genuinely healthy.
We need to interrupt this episode for a quick shout out to our sponsor OneSkin, because let's be honest, nobody wants the skin cells checking out early. It's called cell senescence, when your cells basically start acting old and sluggish. And OneSkin's OS1 peptide is clinically proven to help slow that down. Plus, it's free of those nasty chemicals you'd rather not have hanging around. If you're ready to give your skin some extra love, head over to oneskin.co, that's ONESKIN.co, and use code MKUMMER for 15% off. Now back to our regular scheduled program before any more cells decide to retire.
There is nothing really in bread that you need to enjoy optimal health. Bread is food that is easy to store, or at least the ingredients are easy to store. It's relatively shelf stable. It arguably tastes good, and it pairs well with a lot of other foods, and it's cheap to make at the end of the day. So those are the benefits of bread. But from a health perspective, there's nothing in bread that you need. You could never eat bread and be perfectly healthy. But of course, since it tastes good and it's easy to make and inexpensive to make, that's why people have been consuming it. And, I enjoy the taste of a good sourdough bread, don't get me wrong, but it's nothing that I would make a central part of my diet. And if you've following me for a while, you know that we are on a predominantly animal-based diet. So we eat a lot of animal protein, animal fat, and we add for text, for flavor and texture, etc. We add some plant foods around that. And sourdough is one of those things we have started including in. I don't want to even use the word moderation because I think it's a crappy word in the dietary context. But in smaller amounts, we do enjoy sourdough to the extent that we can tolerate it, and we can tell. And specifically between my wife and I can get away with significantly more than my wife. If she consumes too much sourdough, then her blood sugar goes nuts. She doesn't feel good. There are a lot of things that her body tells her that this is not good for you. And if I consume greater amounts, I feel the same. So we always have to find that threshold. How much can we eat without negatively affecting how we feel and our health overall? Let's talk about flour choices for a while, because you can go to the store, buy just regular, white bread flour and make sourdough and think you're eating something healthier. But the thing is, as you might expect, not all flours are created equal. For example, regular store-bought flour is typically refined, is void of any nutrients and potentially contaminated with glyphosate and other pesticides, so herbicides and pesticides that farmers used to grow that wheat. And so I would avoid regular store-bought flour. The next best option that you can also find in the store sometimes is organic and stone ground flour. That's better because it has more nutrients and it's more minimally processed and has fewer chemicals because of the organic, label on it. So that's the next best option. Even better would be if you grind your flour at home. Get a mill and you mill your flour at home from organic grains to preserve the maximum amount of nutrients, because it matters how much time you let elapse from the time you grind to the time you bake. So the shorter the time frame is, the more nutrients. If you want to consider bread a source of micronutrients, which I don't think it really is, but for the sake of argument, there are going to be more nutrients in the bread if you use freshly ground flour than anything you can buy in the store. And then the last thing to consider is, instead of using regular wheat, which has gone through a lot of modifications and hybridizations and genetic or selection, etc., use ancient grains like einkorn or kamut, or some of those that have not been modified, that are still in the same, that have fewer gluten to go, that have more proteins that our body is familiar with. Because every time you change something, be it by selection or GMO, whatever the case might be, you end up with creating new proteins that are unknown to your body and that could potentially trigger your immune system. And so going with ancient grains and grinding them or milling them at home is significantly better and probably your best option than just buying anything in the store. What does it take to get started with sourdough? Well, the first thing you need is a starter, something that someone has already nurtured for a while. There are sourdough starters available that are hundreds of years old. Now, we got ours from a friend and we've given it to other people then, so we continue the process. But you need the sourdough starter. That's your batch, your starting batch that contains all the bacteria and stuff that you need then to ferment the flour that you add to it and the water. You need a Dutch oven to bake that bread. You need ideally, some sort of a bench scraper to make it easier, you need a proving basket, and you need a kitchen scale. And the one thing most important is you need time. Sourdough is not fast food; it's slow food. It takes somewhere between 2 to 3 days for the entire process. You first feed your starter, then you create the I don't even know what all the terminology is because my wife does all of that. But you create, you let it ferment first, then you go through a second fermentation, etc., etc. So it takes time. You need to be patient and you need to learn the process, because in the beginning it can feel a little bit overwhelming. Just ask my wife. She's like, this is something, I don't know if we want to bother with eating bread if it takes, 3 days to make it, or pizza for this. So let's have pizza tonight. No, you need to plan ahead, 3 days ahead, before you can have that pizza night once a month, hopefully not more often. But I think if you want to have the best quality bread, if you're into bread, that's the way to go. Our personal experience has been that, as I mentioned, we can consume sourdough bread in certain amounts. if we go over it, we suffer the consequences. Again, plants are not supposed to be part in great quantities in the human diet. I firmly believe that. If you overdo it, you suffer the consequences. If I eat too much meat, I suffer from nothing. Unless I eat like 5 pounds of meat in one sitting, then obviously, I would feel something. But if I eat meat every day, I'm perfectly healthy. If I would eat sourdough every day, not so much. So, you get the idea. But specifically between my wife and I, we've noticed difference in how our blood sugar responds. And that's, again, if you don't wear a CGM like the one I do right now, and my wife does as well, you wouldn't even know. I mean, you can feel it, once your blood sugar goes up and down, but tracking those metrics, you can clearly tell how a food or how your body is responding to certain foods. And with sourdough, we have noticed that specifically. So you have to be careful. Just because something is healthier doesn't mean you can just eat sourdough every day and be perfectly healthy. That's likely not the case. A couple of misconceptions I want to address in regards to sourdough. Sourdough is not gluten-free. It has fewer gluten likely, but it's not gluten-free. So if you're hypersensitive or really gluten intolerant, sourdough might not work for you either. The other thing is that all sourdough bread is equally healthy. If you go to a commercial bakery, whatever, that sourdough you get there is likely not the same sourdough that you can make at home from organic, hand-milled ancient grains. I would argue that most sourdough bread you can find in bakeries, etc., are not made with organic flour. Just because that's significantly more expensive, and many people maybe don't want to buy what it costs to bake sourdough bread with ancient organic grains. So the point here is to wrap all of this up. You can enjoy sourdough. I would recommend you experiment with it. Get involved in preparing your own food, and if that means getting involved with baking your own bread, if you enjoy bread, if you would be eating bread otherwise anyway, then by all means do that. Experiment with sourdough. See what it takes to create the best quality bread you can have, and then experiment on how often you can have that. I recommend, again, sticking to consuming predominantly animals to meet your caloric intake, to meet your protein intake, to meet your fat intake. But then, experiment and see if you want to like the taste, the texture, whatever. If you like the social component of sharing bread, of breaking bread, then by all means, experiment with sourdough and let me know how it works for you, how you like it. If you're watching this on a platform that supports comments, let me know in the comments. Share it with someone who could, who thinks that sourdough is healthy, the ultimate health food, or maybe someone who thinks that no bread is healthy. Maybe give some context, some nuance to the discussion by sharing this clip or this podcast if you listen to it on an audio platform. And with that, we're gonna wrap it up, and I hope I'll see you and hear you in the next episode next week.